Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at O Gott, du frommer Gott, which translates to, O God, you righteous God. We've looked at this text in the past. It's been a while since we've looked at it, but we're just going to hop right into the analysis because this is a longer chorale and it has some quirky, just interesting aspects about it that I will talk about in more detail when we get to it. So 2 sharps in the key signature. We start on D major, we end on D major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is D major. This first phrase, however, ends in a cadence that we've talked about a little bit recently, but it isn't really a theme that we've explored in great detail since really the beginning of the channel, or near the beginning of the channel. And it's this idea of the subdominant cadence where the key sort of morphs from D major to G major right at the end, and it sort of feels like we haven't even really left the key of D major, but for the sake of analytical purposes there isn't really a conventional title for cadences that go from 1 to 4. It's like sort of like an inverse of a half cadence where we have the tonic go to another stable chord, maybe like an inverse plagal cadence as well in that same regard. So we start off on 1, we have another D major chord here, D, A, D, and F sharp, no need to reanalyze. We have a passing tone here in the bass, and then we go to F sharp, A, D, and E. I reckon that there are a couple different ways that you can go about looking at this particular chord here. I guess this E has to be part of the chord. We could have G, A, E, and E, or G sharp, A, E, and E, and this could be like a 5-4-2 chord, and this F sharp could be an accented non-chord tone, as well as this D, I guess, by that same sort of logic. You could also analyze this as a 1-6 chord, but this E is sort of functioning like a suspension. Actually, I'm going to take that back. It's more likely that this is some type of 5-4-2 chord, some type of A chord, just by nature of the fact that the I don't know, that there's some interesting counterpoint going on here, and the chord is definitely a bit ambiguous. But yeah, 5-4-2 is, I think, what my final analysis is going to be, and that's further justified by the fact that this takes us to 1-6. F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, D major over F sharp. A little neighbor tone here in the bass here, and then we get F sharp, A, D, and A. That's another 1-6 chord, but in the interest of analyzing this cadence in the key of G major, I'm going to call this 5-6, D major over F sharp, and then we cadence on G major. G, G, D, and B are temporary tonic triad root position. Next phrase takes us to the key of D major. Again, basically right at the beginning, G major turns into our 4 chord. So G, B, D, and B. It's 1 in the key of G major, it's 4 in the key of D major, and that takes us to A major, A, C sharp, and E. It's our 5 chord. Passing 7th in the bass, F sharp, A, C sharp, and E. You could analyze this as a 3 chord. It does make sense, but I think this F sharp's actually an accented non-chord tone. It's really this E here that's operating as the 5th of our chord, which is just taking our 5 chord and putting it in second inversion. And it resolves to D major anyways, so I feel like that makes a little bit more sense. F sharp, A, D, and A. Tonic triad, first inversion. Passing tone in the bass. We then have D major, A, E, and G. Another instance where we have a set of accented, or we have a set of non-chord tones that are the inner of the 2 sets of 4 eighth notes. We see Bach do this from time to time. We also see it in the first system as well, where we have, the phrase as well, where we have 2 non-chord tones in the inner of the eighth notes, which is interesting. So I think this is C sharp, A, E, and G, which is A7 over C sharp. That's 5-6-5, and that resolves to 1 D, A, D, and F sharp tonic triad root position. That'll take us to 5 A major, A, C sharp, and E. A little delayed passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D. Tonic triad root position. Next phrase also is in the key of D major, ends in an imperfect authentic cadence. We have a bit of an interesting progression here near the beginning. We start off with D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, so we don't need to reanalyze. That takes us to G major, G, D, G, and B, which is our 4 chord, passing 7th on the bass, and then we have E, G, G, and B, which is a 2 chord. So 4 going to 2 is an interesting progression. We do see it from time to time. Sometimes we see 4 going to 2 like in a cadential context, which is sort of how this is operating, even though we get sort of 2 5 chords here happening at the end of the phrase. But yeah, usually when we have 2 chords that are similar in terms of their pitch content, they're usually separated by like a buffer chord or a buffer tone. Like bare minimum, this is what we'll see. We'll see a passing tone in one of the voices to separate the 2 of them. But if you listen to it, 4 and 2 are not all that different from one another because they share most of their tones. Passing 7th on the bass, passing tone in the alto before we get C sharp, A, E, and A. It's 5-6, A major over C sharp. Neighbor tones in the bass and the alto here before we get basically another A chord in first inversion. This time we just have the 7th, which would make this just 5-6-5. We'll add the 7 there too. C sharp, A, E, and G. This A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then the cadence ends with D major, D, A, D, and F sharp. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase modulates to the key of A major. We end in a perfect authentic cadence, and we spend pretty much the entirety of our of the phrase in the key of A major because we see the G sharp and the A happening here in the melody. So we start off with A major, A, C sharp, and E, which is our 5 chord still. I don't think the modulation happens until we get to the D, but I think it's valid to say that the modulation happens as early as the beginning of the phrase. I think what matters, the big picture here is that the modulation happens by the time we get to this A major chord. So we move to D major here, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is currently our tonic. We also have a neighboring 7th here in the bass, but it's also our 4 chord in the key of A. And that takes us to D, D, E, and G sharp. Sorry, this is a B, which would make this 5-4-2. Just kind of like how we saw at the beginning of the chorale as well. We saw a 4-2 chord, a 5-4-2 chord more specifically, resolved to a 1-6 chord. This B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. I guess technically it turns it into a 6-4 chord very briefly, but I don't think it's really changing the harmony so much as it is enclosing the C sharp. So we have C sharp, A, E, and A. Like I said, it's a 1-6 chord. And that takes us to B minor 7 over D, D, A, F sharp, and B. It's a 2-6-5 chord. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. C sharp is a non-chord tone. D is a chord tone. That takes us to a 5 chord, or I guess an accessory to a 5 chord. We have E, A, E, and C sharp, which is 1-6-4, A major in second inversion. A little neighbor tone here in the bass. That takes us to 5, E, G sharp, E, and B, with a delayed passing 7th here in the alto. Go ahead and write a bracket there. It's just a habit of mine because that's how I learned how to do it when I was taking harmony classes. And then we have A major, A, E, C sharp, and A. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase sort of loops us back into the same vibe that we had at the beginning of the chorale, where we will end in the key of G major, but it really gets sprung up on us at the very end. So we start off, actually, I think, going to the key of D major, namely because of the fact that we're no longer seeing G sharps. I guess there's nothing technically keeping us in. We could stay in the key of A major here and modulate straight to the key of G major from A major because they both have D major in common. I think they also have B minor in common. But this sounds like a 5-to-1 progression in the key of D major to start the phrase off. So A, E, C sharp, and A again is also 1 in the key of A, but it's 5 in the key of D as well. That takes us to D major, D, F sharp, D, and A, which is our tonic. Then we have neighbor tones in the lower voices, D, F sharp, D, and A again, no need to reanalyze. There's the G natural with the F sharps. no C sharps actually, so there's really nothing keeping us from modulating directly to the key of D here, but I mean to the key of G, apologies. It just doesn't really sound harmonically like that's what's happening. This sounds like a 5-to-1 progression in the key of D, but like I said, semantically speaking, there's really nothing keeping you from just going straight to the key of G if that's how you want to analyze it. But we go to D major in first inversion, F sharp, A, D, and D, which is our tonic in first inversion, and also because we're going to be seeing C natural here, I think this is where we modulate to the key of G, so we have some what I've been calling mid-phrase modulation, where typically Bach will modulate to a key, like we start the key off, or the phrase here in the key of D major, and we stay in D major for the entirety of the key. Once we see a modulation in this phrase, we stay in that key. However, it's not super uncommon for Bach to modulate to a key, then modulate again by the end of the phrase. So at least 2 modulations in the phrase. So now in the key of G major, this is 5-6. Neighbor tones in the lower voices. We have F sharp, A, D, and C, which is just taking our chord and adding a 7th. So that'd be 7-6-5. B is an anticipation. F sharp is a chord tone, D is a chord tone, and then our imperfect authentic cadence ends in the key of G. And I think the big picture here is that over these 3 phrases, Bach is going to sort of scaffold his way up the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th scale degrees of the D major scale if we're looking at the overall form and how it relates to the key of the tonic. So this next phrase, despite the fact that we're going to go to A using kind of some unconventional means here, the ending key I think is more significant than what device Bach uses to get there. So we have another imperfect authentic cadence. We know we're going to the key of A, but I think we're going there via the key of E minor, which is a distant modulation. But the phrases are so short, Bach really doesn't solidify the key of E minor with a dominant, really. We just know that E minor gets a lot of attention due to the fact that we have this leading tone here, the leading tone to E, the secondary leading tone. So we start off with G major, G, D, G, and B. No need to reanalyze. Passing 7th in the bass takes us to E minor, E, E, G, and B, which I think is 6 in the key of G minor and is also 1 in the key of E minor. This phrase is definitely enigmatic. There are lots of different ways that you can go about analyzing it, but oh, sorry, I hit my desk there. I'm going to wait for the camera to stabilize, and we're good. We have a passing secondary neighbor tone here, which if we kept it in the key of G major, it would be a secondary neighbor tone, but the fact that we're in the key of E minor, it is now our leading tone. And what's interesting is that for all intents and purposes, we're thinking we're going to stay in the key of E minor, but Bach switches it up with this G sharp here, and it's kind of fascinating how he goes about doing that. So we get another E minor chord on the next beat, E, E, G, and B, with some passing tones in the alto and the bass as well, before we get E major, G sharp, B, B, and E, which I think is just usage of the Picardy third. We're just seeing the usage of parallel minor and parallel major happening at the same time here. So we're going from 1 to 1-6 major, which is now our 5 chord in the key of A major. That's how I have it analyzed. I'd have to go back and look at my previous analyses of this particular melody in order for me to verify to see if Bach used a similar device, but this is definitely a quirky one for sure. There's really no I guess there's really no straightforward relationship. There's no real diatonic relationship between E minor and A major. Actually, you could modulate using D major, like the flat 7. You could modulate using A major, actually, using melodic minor. But other than that, I would have to think about how you would move from E minor to A major, but there are 2 options there as well. But I think that this situation here where E minor pivots to A major is definitely very fascinating, and even though I'm not 100% convinced, this is really the only way that I could see the relationship happening given the chords that are present in the chorale. So we have some neighbor tones in the bass and the alto before we get E7 over G sharp, kind of similar to the ending of the previous phrase, G sharp, E, B, and D. So we'll just use the same figured bass as we did at the beginning or at the end of the previous phrase. G sharp's a chord tone, C sharp's an anticipation, E is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And then we cadence on A major, A, E, A, and C sharp. And the next phrase breaks the harmonic relationship between, like, or the harmonic symmetry that's happening between these two phrases here. But yeah, actually, now the more that I think about it, I think if Bach is really using keys that are diatonically related to the key of D major, we have D and G, they're a fourth apart, and then we have E and A, which are also a fourth apart, and we have E minor, which is diatonic to D major, and A major, which is diatonic to D major. I think that that's what's happening here, is that Bach is only using keys that are diatonically related to the key of D major here, which I guess is typically how it works, but the fourth relationship between the keys in this like almost sequential passage is really fascinating. I'm pretty sure that that's what Bach was going for here. In the next phrase, Bach is going to explore the key of B minor, but I think he's going to do so through the key of D major. Either D major or G major, it's kind of hard to say with 100% certainty. There's been some absence of like crucial tones that would otherwise, make it clearer. The fact that we have F sharp here going to, F sharp going up to G, or D major going to G, is an argument for the fact that we're going from G major to to B minor. But the fact that we have this descending C sharp here, I don't know if by that point we're in the key of B minor, or if it's what I'm trying to say is that this phrase really could be G major to D major, or D major to B minor, or G major to B minor. So we have F sharp, D, D, and A, which I'm going to say is in the key of D major. So the modulation will have started from the previous A chord where it's our 5 chord, and then this D major chord will be 1-6, and that takes us to 4, G, D, G, and B. And then we arpeggiate the G major chord here in the bass where we have B, which is in first inversion. When we skip up a third here in the bass, we don't need to mark it because it's a chord tone, but it does structurally change the spelling of the chord. We then get D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad, root position, neighbor tone in the bass, and then we get B, D, F sharp, and B, which is our 6th chord in the key of D minor, in first inversion actually, and the key of B minor, it is 1-6, passing tone in the bass, B, C sharp, F sharp, and C sharp. It's probably this A sharp that is our chord tone here. That would be F sharp major over A sharp, which is our 5 chord, and our imperfect authentic cadence ends with B minor, B, B, F sharp, and D. So we can see that Bach, over the span of this, I guess because there's no repeat, it's hard to differentiate the sections, but it sort of feels like something new is starting in and around measure 9. We have D going to G, E going to A, and even if this were in the key of G major, G going to B would be, it wouldn't be a fourth relationship, so it wouldn't preserve that at all. D going to B doesn't either, but it is a fourth away from A. I don't know, I think that it just sort of breaks here, and really what matters is the endings of the phrases. We have a phrase ending in G, a phrase ending in A, and then a phrase ending in B. And because C sharp isn't like a tonicizable chord in the major scale, Bach goes directly from B to D major, and I do think this B minor is going to be a common chord between the two keys. We start the phrase off with F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. We have some passing tones in the inner voices, which technically gives us F sharp minor 7, F sharp, C sharp, E, and A, which would be 3-7. And I'm going to mark that because it goes to a 4 chord, and 3 going to 4 is a relatively normative progression by Bach standards. G, B, D, and B. Passing tones in the outer voices here before we have B, B, D, and G, which is just taking our chord and putting it in first inversion. G is a chord tone, D is a chord tone, F sharp is a passing 7th, so here the chord is technically turning into a root position 7 chord. Let me add the whole figured bass there before we go to 5. A, C sharp and E, A major in root position, and then we get another A major chord, A, C sharp and E with a delayed passing 7th, and our final cadence is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. D, F sharp, A, and D, which is typical ending for a chorale. Nothing exceptional about the ending of the last phrase. But really this ending here, especially how we move from E minor to A, this use of sort of parallel major and minor to modulate distantly is pretty interesting. But yeah, I think the big takeaway here is what happens to the harmonic structure moving from the key of G major through the key of B minor here. He really scaffolds his way up the key diatonically, and this especially preserving this fourths relationship between D and G and E and A, which it's pretty cool. But yeah, especially the fact that we have this movement from E minor to A major that is a distant modulation, which is not foreign to Bach. We see distant modulations with a bit of regularity, but definitely not in the middle of the phrase turning one chord from minor to major to get there. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all I want to talk about in this particular chorale. Oh, and also we do have a subdominant cadence here at the beginning of the chorale. This one at the end, even though there are similarities between the beginning of the chorale and the beginning of the B section, I think that this is not a subdominant cadence because Bach sort of incorporates this C natural here, which is a core contextual tone for G major, whereas he avoids it here and ends on G major very abruptly. Yeah, I think that that's pretty much all I wanted to cover in this chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.